Hello and good afternoon. Thank you all for coming to this professional development series hosted by the Graduate Student Council. This is about the interview workshop. Thank you for coming. I know it's been busy this time of the semester, and it's great seeing your faces here. So our speaker for today is Jared Mittler. Jared is the Associate Editor of the Career Center and serves as the liaison to the graduate school advising graduate students in the College of Arts and Sciences. He has experiences in business and volunteer leadership and management and is passionate about supporting others' personal and professional development and helping people uncover who they become. So without further ado, I will give the floor to Jared.
All right, everyone. Well, it's good to be here with you all. Excited to see some familiar faces in the room that I've seen in different things before, which is awesome. As Roselle said, my name is Jared. I work at the Career Center, and Arts and Sciences grad students are who I most frequently connect with. Just as a plug, so you know, during your programs, you have full access to the Career Center's services and resources, which would include one-on-one advising with our advising team. How many of you are enrolled in programs in the College of Arts and Sciences? All right, so what colleges are each of you in? Or what program?
I'm in College of Agriculture, Department of Plant Path.
Plant Path, okay. How about you?
Agriculture, Department of Plant.
Okay, same way. How about you?
Department of Agricultural Economics.
Agicon, okay.
Agriculture and Grain Science.
Grain Science and? All right, sounds good. All right, well, that will make things easy from a referral then. Just so you all know, if you ever wanted to get support or assistance from the Career Center, your liaison or advisor in our office, his name is Mary Ellen Barkley. So I know that you all get wonderful resources and guidance and mentoring from your major professors or whoever you're working with in pursuit of your dissertation or your master's degree. But in addition to that, as a student at K-State, you have full access to one-on-one career advising through our office. Mary Ellen Barkley is a liaison to the College of Agriculture as well as Vet Med. And so if you ever wanted to schedule a time to come talk with her about job search, looking at your CV, helping you polish your LinkedIn profile, or perhaps doing a mock interview or following up with some of the things that I discussed with you today, Mary Ellen would be the person in our office that you would meet with during your time here. So just know that that's a resource that's widely available. Roselle, what are you in?
I go to the College of Engineering.
Okay, what program?
Biological and Agriculture.
Okay, sounds good. So for the College of Engineering, Anthony Ibarra is the liaison, and just like with the College of Ag, all those one-on-one kind of supports are available to you as well. So I wanted to make sure to start there because I think a lot of times with this topic, it's one thing to get it in kind of a seminar setting, but we each have individual needs when it comes time for the rubber to hit the road and we go after these opportunities. And so just know that you've got kind of a career Sherpa at your disposal that you can utilize as well. You came to this session, I'm guessing for a variety of different reasons, but when you think about the idea of interviewing, what are some thoughts or emotions that you feel with that thought in mind?
Kind of scary.
All right, fear, that's a common one. Thanks for sharing. How about for others?
And the fact that you feel like you might not be saying the right answer.
Yeah, absolutely. Am I saying the right things? There's a little bit of just like questioning yourself that comes along with it. How about for others? Thoughts or feelings that you have about the idea of interviewing for a potential opportunity?
Getting nervous?
Yeah, nerves, absolutely, super common. Yeah, and I find that typically speaking with the nerves, it's most common when it's something that we really care about, right? So if you're going after an opportunity, you're like, yeah, I don't really care how this happens. You're probably not going to be nearly as nervous as if it's that, you know, that postdoc position that you're really excited about, or the professorial or industry role as a scientist that you might be interested in. What I've found in working with students is that fear is kind of the most common described emotion that comes along with the idea of interviewing. And so I'm kind of curious, if that's the observation, that fear is common, what would you all interpret the reasons behind fear being? Why do you think fear is most commonly referred to as what we feel when we're preparing for interviews?
Maybe we'll get unexpected questions.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in addition to the unexpected questions, the entire experience is a little bit ambiguous.
Mhm.
And oftentimes ambiguity is something that leads to the feeling of fear. And it's not just with the questions, but am I going to connect with the people that are interviewing me? Will I look the part that they are expecting me to look when I come up to interview for this role? Will technology support this as I am doing my interview over the phone or via Zoom, et cetera? And so I think, again, a lot of the ambiguity that comes along with interviews is what oftentimes creates that fear. And so oftentimes when we're talking with candidates about interviews, we kind of start with just acknowledging that that's a reality and something that's probably going to be present. And then we kind of talk through the typical strategies that can help eliminate some of that ambiguity. Can't eliminate all of it 100% because typically speaking, every interview is a little bit different. However, I will say that the things that we're going to talk about today will hopefully eliminate or at least lessen some of that fear that you might have going into an interview setting. So we're going to spend time talking about kind of common interview questions and strategies for answering those. We're also going to walk through some logical approaches to preparing for interviews in the future. We're going to give you a chance to practice a little bit with some of the questions that we talked about. And then we'll save plenty of time at the end for just kind of one-on-one or kind of group questions that you might have based on the topics that we cover. So what we know is that regardless of field, there are some common interview questions. This data I pulled from LinkedIn, and this is information that's reported by employers from a variety of industries and fields. So of course, there will be variation based on the specific job or industry that you're in. But by and large, the questions that are up on the screen right now represent some pretty common interview questions that as folks going into the field in the next few years, you can expect and would be a good idea to prepare for in some way. I think a really smart place for us to start today is with the number one most frequently used interview question that exists in the world, which is, tell me about yourself. How many of you have experienced this question at a networking or interview experience in the past? Anybody ever had tell me about yourself asked of you? Yeah, so most of the room. So tell me about yourself is really easy from an employer's perspective because it's a nice segue and it's open-ended and they can learn a lot about you in a little bit of time because you as the candidate or you as the person at the other side of the networking conversation have full reign of whatever you want to talk about, you can share. It's not prescriptive like some of the rest of these questions are, where there's a kind of a narrow tunnel that you're walking through. Tell me about yourself is wide open and you can choose to share a number of different things. What we find with candidates is that oftentimes this is a little bit ambiguous, because of how free reign you have on what direction you might want to go. A lot of candidates aren't sure, do I talk about just being a student? Do I talk about my research? Do I talk about my hobbies? Do I talk about my family? Do I talk about, I don't know. And all of those options are certainly on the table. But one of the things that we're going to start with today is a really kind of specific approach that can be applied to answering that tell me about yourself question. There has been research done that shows that many employers will make kind of a gut reaction about whether they want to move forward with hiring the person or not in about the first 5 minutes of the interview. And what we know is that tell me about yourself is not only the most common interview question, it's typically the first one. And so nailing the response to tell me about yourself can make a large impact on your ability to move forward in that process or not. And so we're going to spend time there first. As career advisors, we go through kind of ongoing training and industry research about what's happening with hiring practices across all industries. And in the last 6 months, our staff went through a training that was led by a gentleman named Steve Dalton Steve Dalton is most well known. A few years ago, he wrote a book called The 2-Hour Job Search, and it's been updated a couple of times. It's a fantastic read that I would highly recommend to anyone, regardless of field. There are wonderful tips and pointers in here. I came across this book probably about 6 years ago and really appreciated some of the points that he made, because in my work, I'm helping people that are very, very busy and have minimum amounts of time to lend to the job search process. You all, as master's and PhD students, know you're juggling a lot of things, right? And so layering the job search into those realities can be really, really hard, because it feels like just one more thing. And it's a really important thing, thinking about the next step. And so the 2-Hour Job Search is a great book, but what leads me here in thinking about the tell me about yourself question is over years of doing kind of the similar work to what I do. So Steve Dalton was a career coach in the Duke School of Business for a number of years. He started to recognize kind of an approach that can be very helpful when answering that tell me about yourself question. And that's what we're going to spend a little bit of time with here over the next few minutes. So I encourage you to, as you're taking notes or want to take a picture of this, I encourage you to do so. So the FIT model, or the acronym FIT, is basically the approach that we're going to talk about. And I'll explain it to you, I'll give you an example, and then again, we're going to take a little bit of an opportunity here for you all to practice this as well. So the FIT model, what does it mean? Well, basically, what this means is in response to the tell me about yourself question, you can apply this model and you can go back as far as you'd like. You can skip as many experiences as you want. But as a candidate, it allows you to really focus on the things that you feel like are most pertinent for the person at the other end of that conversation to understand. So to start with, the F in FIT stands for favorites. So what was your favorite thing about an experience? The I stands for an insight you gained during or from that experience. And then the T is your transition statement into the next experience. So for example, one way that I could apply the FIT model is, let's say I wanted to go back to a part-time job that I had when I was navigating my undergrad experience as a student at K-State. So my favorite thing about working in management at the location that I was at was 95% of our employees were college students. And I found that I really, really valued helping college students navigate whatever it was that they were experiencing and connecting that to the bigger picture and what they wanted to do. An insight that I gained from that experience was that I didn't really like working 80-hour weeks during the holidays, and that was required of the role that I was in. So my transition was that I started looking for opportunities on a college campus where I could apply the work that I love to do, helping college students navigate from A to B, but didn't have to work 80-hour weeks during the holidays. So what's beautiful about the FIT model that I just demonstrated is that you can keep looping that experience and go through in a chronological way the experiences that you would like for an employer or whoever you're networking with to understand. And I kind of think about this as a chain. You know, a chain is interlooped and locked in, but with this model, you get to kind of choose how long that chain is. So what I want to give you just a couple minutes here is I want you to think about what your FIT model would work like. So whether you're writing this down, taking notes on your phone, whatever that might look like, what I would encourage you to do, jot down what maybe one or two using the FIT framework might look like in your experience. So I think a good way to start is, because oftentimes with these models or approaches, what's hard is like, what's my first thing? What's the thing that I'm going to start with? So I would encourage you all as master's and PhD students to think about your favorite thing from high school or as an undergraduate student that you experienced that led you to want to further your education or wanted you to further your experience in that field. So that's where you're going to start. So thinking about high school or your experience during your undergrad that was really kind of pivotal in you being here today where you're at. And you're going to start with that. With your insight statement, you can kind of go one of two ways. what Steve recommends is you find the thing that you didn't like about the experience that led you to pursue the next thing. So for me, what I didn't like was working 80-hour weeks during the holidays, which I shared. However, if you don't want to share something that you didn't like or that could be perceived as negative, the other way that you could take this is something that really deeply engaged you, that drove your desire for more learning or more experience in that field. Obviously, if you're choosing to pursue a master's degree or a PhD in the field, there's something that has driven you to get there. And that could be a number of different things, but that would also be an insight that you gained. And that could be an insight that you learned from a pivotal faculty member or mentor that you have. It could be an insight that you gained from a specific experience that you were involved with. But either way, you want to pick out what was the one kind of pivotal or monumental insight that you gained that led you to go to the next thing. And then kind of your transition is talking about how that insight or the desire for more led you to whatever the next experience was. Now, what's beautiful about this is you can go from undergraduate degree program to master's degree program to PhD program. You could go from undergraduate degree program to internship, to master's degree program, to industry experience, to PhD. You can literally apply the FIT model however you want, but what's important is making sure that those transitions are kind of seamless from one to the next, and that the insights from the previous experience lead you to those transitions. So I'm going to pause here for, I don't know, probably about 2 minutes. I want to give you a little bit of time to maybe jot some notes, type some notes, whatever that looks like for you, about what your kind of elevator pitch or your response to tell me about yourself might be if you were using the FIT model. And then after that, I want to give you a chance to kind of partner up and say that out loud to someone else. Because what we find in the interview prep world is the more you replicate the lived experience, the more comfortable you're going to be when you share that out loud with an employer or in a networking setting. So before I give you some time to kind of pause and reflect on your own, questions about the FIT model or how it flows.
How long should it be?
Yeah, awesome question, Roselle. I'm glad you asked it. So generally speaking, a really solid kind of tell me about yourself response would be around 1 minute to 1.5 minutes. Now, that's different for every situation, but in most interview settings, that's a good kind of range to shoot for. For your practice setting, you don't necessarily have to go that long, but I would encourage you as you're preparing for different interview settings to think about kind of that 60 to 90 seconds as a best practice or a vision of good. Other questions before I give you a little bit of time? Okay, well, like I said, let's take about 2 minutes and then I'll have you kind of partner up so you can practice this out loud here in just a moment. Go for it.
I was able to do was a bit well because just so long a child. So this is like because I like yeah. She knew me faster. So first, yeah, for this.
All right. Let's go ahead and bring it back as a large group. I guess I'm curious first, what was that like? How did it go? What did you think? I see one nodding head. So what's your reaction to how this went?
So, although I have something in mind to say, but I could not express properly.
I got you. So your thoughts were there mentally, but the delivery needed work. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so that's common, I think, is the first thing to mention. And one thing that I always encourage candidates to do when they're working through this process of preparation is typing up a script or at least a framework or an outline of a script. And then from that, taking some time to practice what that might sound like out loud. And that's the reason why we do this out loud, right? Is so you can get some repetition in, just like an experiment, right? First time you run an experiment or have a new experience in a lab setting that you haven't had before, sometimes it doesn't go perfect. Most of the time, it does not go perfect. But over time, with repetition and practice, you improve. So thank you for that insight. What are other reactions? There were loud laughs back in the corner when I asked the question. So that helps. Yeah, absolutely. Having a prior connection is certainly helpful. Other reactions? I guess I'm a little bit curious too. You know, most of your hands went up when I asked, how many of you have had this question before? Do you feel like the FIT model was helpful, or compared to you coming up with an answer to that question in the past? Do you feel confident in what your response was before? How would you compare and contrast using the FIT model to how your kind of previous approach to answering the tell me about yourself question would have been?
I think this one is more organized, because in the past when I was asked that question, I was like, oh, there's a lot of things that I want to say. And right now there's just focus on your favorite thing, and then from there gain what insights have you gained, and then how do you transition from your favorite thing to your insight. So it gave me a more structured response compared to my previous experience.
Yeah. So provided a more structured or organized response. When we get feedback from employers, a lot of times what we learn from them is that one of the biggest challenges that interviewees have when they're in the interview setting, they don't know when to stop talking. And so what I love about the FIT model is there's a pretty clear kind of beginning, middle, and end of the story. Now your loop can continue as many iterations as you'd like, but still, once you get to kind of where you're at now and you talk about the transition to the now, you're done. And that can be really helpful. What were you gonna say?
My previous approach was usually saying common things that they can actually see in my CV. I think it's more personalized, so they get to know more about you than just reading your CV.
Yeah, absolutely. They can gain tremendous insight to maybe those highlights from your CV that you might still find a way to fold in to that response. That's good. Other comparison, contrast to prior experiences answering that question.
I think it makes you more confident about answering that question.
Yeah, that's great. We're all about increasing confidence in interview settings. So it's wonderful to hear that. Yeah, well, my hope is that this is something concrete and tangible. What I originally loved about the FIT model when I learned about it the first time is it's simple. You know, you don't have to have a PhD in English to understand the structure and framework of delivery, right? It's very simple and straightforward. And I think from a listener's point of view, it's easy to comprehend for someone else that would be responding to the question in this way. So hopefully it's helpful for you in the future. We're going to transition and talk a little bit more about how to deduct what types of interview questions you might be able to predict might come at you in an interview setting. One of the things that we talked about earlier was that some of the fear in an interview or in preparing for an interview comes from the unknown, the ambiguity of it all, especially with regards to not knowing what questions might happen. And so when I'm working with candidates, a lot of the times I'll coach them on ensuring that they're looking for clues based on the specific position that they are applying for. So out of curiosity, how many of you anticipate that you'll be applying for academic focused roles after graduation? All right, and then how about you, industry? How many of you are trying to decide between the two right now? Okay, yeah, so all of those things, very common with graduate and PhD students. So I totally understand. I'm going to break them out into separate categories because typically speaking, the academic job search and the industry job search look a little bit different. So with academic roles, what I have found for most faculty-related positions is that departments and deans are looking for experience in 3 very important categories. Anybody want to take a guess what those 3 categories are? Research, teaching. So service, which extension in many ways could certainly fit in that category. Yeah, so again, 3 categories are research, teaching, and service. So what's helpful about knowing that those are the 3 important categories that most academic roles are going to focus on is when you're thinking about your experience and the type of experiences that you should be sharing about in an interview setting, if you're focused mostly on those 3 areas, then you're probably going to check the boxes that they're looking to have you check during that interview. Some other places that are really helpful to understand what they might be looking for is your personal alignment or your values-based alignment with that organization's mission and the strategic plan or priorities that are happening there. So for example, working at a land-grant institution that's primarily focused on research and serving the greater good or the community, like K-State, might be different than if you're applying to be a faculty member at a small liberal arts college. And so understanding the nuanced differences between the mission of that institution and the strategic plan that they're working on right now is very, very important to make sure that your responses align with what they're looking for. Now, a couple of things that are very similar with industry roles that you might be applying for is you can learn a lot about the company from their mission. And you can also learn a lot about the company from the types of information that they share on social media. And so while this is also true with institutions, I would say it's much more prominent with organizations outside of higher education. The other thing that can be really, really helpful, if you're not active on LinkedIn right now, one of the reasons that I would advocate for you to be active on LinkedIn is you can learn a lot about what's happening in your specific industry by following companies, thought leaders, and organizations that are affiliated with whatever industry it is that your niche area is involved with. And so those would be some places where you can get some clues. But I will always, with little exception, when working with a candidate one-on-one, the main place that we will go to find clues about what your interview might entail will certainly be taking a look at job descriptions. So right now, I am currently working with a grad student who is considering a number of different opportunities. And one of the opportunities that they're considering is a scientist role in Stanford, California. So one of the things that we can glean from this job description, actually, I'm going to look at it. Okay, so there's a lot of information that's typically shared in job descriptions. But one of the places that I always encourage candidates to review very, very closely are the required and preferred qualifications for the role. So let's just take a minute here beyond the education, and I want to give you a chance to review kind of this information that's over here on the right side of the screen. So let's just review this. And then based on what you observe, I want you to share with me what you think might be some information that they're trying to learn about in an interview setting. So as you look at these different things that they're looking for, what types of questions or categories of questions do you think an interviewer might ask? All right, so based on what you're seeing, what do you think is the type of question that might get asked in an interview setting?
Question, so basic understandings. First one.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. So they might be able to try to glean specifically what technical skills you have, right? Or what's your lab experience? What type of research have you done in your specific field? So yeah, looking at the first bullet point, trying to get some of that, gleaning some insight into the technical capabilities and experience that you have. What else?
Any leadership roles in the past, or your experiences in working with people.
Okay. So as an example of that, Roselle, which one of these bullet points would lead you to believe that that's the case?
Lead projects and provide direction for our students.
Yeah, good. Yep, absolutely. So if you know that there's going to be an expectation that you're leading projects or providing direction to others, they're probably going to ask you questions about your experience doing that. What else sticks out that you think you might be able to predict getting a question about if this was a role you're applying for?
And also level of knowledge about the scouting.
Yeah, absolutely. So what's your level of knowledge with these different techniques that you might be asked to do or experience in a field or lab setting? Very, very good.
Another maybe the engagement with the, project teams.
Absolutely.
How we can collaborate.
Yeah, what is your teamwork? What's the extent of your teamwork skills? What's your ability to work with others that are similar to you, that are different than you? What's maybe a time when you've had a conflict working in team experience, right? One of the approaches that I'll often encourage candidates to take is using the job description and getting out a highlighter or the highlight tool on your computer and going through and trying to identify the transferable skills that come from a previous experience and how that aligns with what you have. So very quickly, there's some keywords here that would tell me I'm going to get a question about this. Teamwork is certainly one, technical experience, leadership experience, plan, organize, and oversee would tell me that they're needing me to be able to execute on project management. One of the things that they talk about down here is communication skills. And so those are going to be important. They also talk about writing technical reports. And so big picture, my encouragement to you all as you're looking at different opportunities and preparing for interviews is rather than let the ambiguity of the interview process intimidate you, use the information that is being provided to you as a form of a cheat sheet or an open book test, or at least a view into what you might experience in that interview setting. Most interviews are hinged on the idea that your prior behavior is a really strong prediction on what your future behavior is going to look like. And so they're really looking for insights on your prior behavior in these areas to understand how they might be able to see you in the role. And honestly, using a job description is a great way to do that. So again, organizational mission, information that they share, industry insights, all important. But at the end of the day, they're hiring you to do a specific job. And so you need to be able to communicate the transferable skills that are coming from those specific jobs. Questions about picking apart a job description or how this can be helpful or useful in preparation? Does this all make sense? A vast majority of you will experience behavioral interview questions as you navigate your interview experiences. You will experience interviews from potential human resource personnel, from recruiters, and some of you will also experience interviews from technical folks or maybe the lead scientists or managers that are overseeing the labs or the research that's happening in the settings that you're applying for. One of the things that we know is that behavioral-based interview questions are very in the most common, especially when you are interviewing with human resource professionals. However, when you are working with those that might be directly supervising you, they might ask more questions about your technical skills. And so one thing that I would just encourage you to be aware of is something that's really helpful to ask as a follow-up question when an organization reaches out to you about interviewing with them is, who will I be interviewing with and how many people will be there? Because that can give you, again, more clues about the types of questions that you might anticipate receiving. So for example, if you're going to do a pre-screen interview with an organization with 2 HR personnel, you might anticipate more behavioral-based interview questions and clarification about the role. Whereas if you are doing maybe a second round or third round interview that's going to be with the manager of the lab that you're applying for, you might be able to anticipate more technical questions that are based on your specific industry or skill set that you've developed in that area. And so that's another thing that I always encourage candidates to do, is to try to seek out as much information as you can about who you're interviewing with and what their roles are with the organization. I gave a couple of examples here of some very, very common behavioral-based interview questions. And behavioral-based interview questions are things like, tell me about a time when, describe an experience where, or give me an example of a time when. So any questions that kind of start with that and then fill in kind of the rest of the question, you can use a very specific and tailored approach to responding to. Does anybody know the acronym that you can follow to answering behavioral-based interview questions? Well, that's great. That means learning will happen today, and that's what we're here for. All right, so the specific acronym that we encourage candidates to use when responding to behavioral-based interview questions is called the STAR method, S-T-A-R. So the STAR method can really be used for any one of those types of questions that I just discussed. Tell me about a time, describe a situation, give me an example of an experience. What's beautiful about this is, like the FIT model that was referenced earlier, the STAR method gives you a structured format where you can keep your thoughts very organized and straightforward. And it also gives you a very specific clue about when to stop talking, knowing again that for many candidates, that's a challenge, is not knowing when to stop. So the STAR method, very simply put, stands for situation, task, action, result. I'll walk through what that means and then try to give you an example so that you can hear it. And then just like with the FIT model, we're going to take a moment here in just a few minutes to maybe jot down a response and then give ourselves an opportunity to practice as well. So what we know about stories and meaningful storytelling is that every great story has a very clear beginning, middle, and end. And what's nice about the STAR method is it gives you a framework for storytelling, which is basically what responding to interview questions is in reality. So situation. Basically, with the situation area, you are providing context or trying to paint a picture of what was happening with the response that you're about to deliver. The task is the challenge or the problem or the issue that you or a group or team were working on. The action is what you did. So your specific role in that experience, and kind of the one up on this is if you're able to translate how that experience connects to whatever the job is that you're applying for. And then finally, the result is what was the outcome? So this is the end of the story. This is where you get to celebrate that great thing that you did or how you had an impact. So this is kind of your impact statement. What was the outcome? So for example, let's say I got a question that was, tell me about a time when you had to manage multiple competing priorities. As masters and PhD students, I know that you're very adept in this experience. So if I got that question, I'm going to walk through what STAR would look like. So situation. When I was in the second year, spring semester of my master's program, I was working full-time, taking 6 credit hours in my graduate program. I was in a practicum experience for 8 hours a week to complete my graduate program. And I was managing having a child at home and life with my partner as well. Task. I didn't know that during the middle of the semester, one of the things that was going to be needed to graduate was for me to successfully pass my comprehensive exams for my program. So in addition to having all of those things going on, I had to find a way to budget enough time to successfully prepare to pass my comprehensive exams that were scheduled for mid-March. Action. Knowing that I am someone who is much more accountable when I'm working in a group setting, I set up a study group of 2 other people that were in my cohort who had similar life situations to me. We were managing multiple things, but knew that we wanted to be successful in our comprehensive exams. We came up with kind of an 8-week prep plan where we would get together 2 times for 45 minutes to an hour per week, where we could execute on different topics that we knew were going to be on the comprehensive exam. Result, I passed. While it might have been a stressful time in preparation for that, I know that one of the reasons that I was able to successfully complete my comprehensive exams was because of the planning that went into the execution process. And ultimately, all 3 of us kind of met the goal, which was to pass successfully on our first iteration. So again, situation, task, action, result. Very clear beginning, middle, and end. You set the scene at the beginning, you tell what the task is and what your specific role was in it, and then again, you deliver the result. Now, sometimes you might have responses where the result was maybe not something that you loved, or it didn't go quite as well as you had hoped. And in those cases, you should always add an L to the end of this acronym. So instead of just star, star L. Who can think of what the L means? Yeah, what'd you learn? So what was the lesson that you learned from that experience? So star and star L kind of go hand in hand, but especially if you're sharing something that didn't go as according to plan or as well as you would have liked, making sure to include what you learned from that experience is critically important. Questions about the STAR method for responding to interview questions? Or is that pretty clear? All right, well, I want to give you then just a minute here. And one of the things that I encourage candidates to always do walking into an interview setting is thinking about those key experiences that you know you want to get across in an interview setting. Each of us have those moments where, we reflect and we think, that was a moment where I was at my best, or this is something that was an incredible learning experience for me that was kind of pivotal or monumental in my experience. And so I encourage candidates to outline the STAR framework and take that framework of that response into an interview setting with you. Now, one of the things that's very commonly, I think, assumed going into an interview setting is that the interviewer expects you to have all this stuff ready and prepared up here. That it's not okay for you to have notes that you're referencing. However, I'm wondering, if you are going to write a grant and have to interview with a panel about the grant that you had written to do a project on, I think you'd be kind of crazy to not show up with some notes prepared about the things that you would want to say out loud as you got questions about that defensive why you want that grant. Interviews should be exactly the same. I would encourage all of you, regardless of whether you're interviewing on the phone, via Zoom, in person, have some notes with you that are already outlined some of the responses that you know that you want to deliver. And I'm not saying that you should write a 2-minute response verbatim and read it. However, outlining a couple keywords or phrases that you know are going to trigger your memory if you get a question about communication or teamwork or problem solving can be really, really powerful in the moment so that it can spawn your memory to deliver that in kind of a meaningful way for an employer. So what I'd like to have you do over the next couple of minutes is let's go back to our list of questions here. What I'd like to have you do is I want you to think about and either write down or note on your phone what a STAR response might look like for one of the 3 questions on the board. So tell me about a time when you had a positive experience working as a member of a team. Give an example of a time when you had multiple competing priorities, or describe a major project or task that you needed help with. What did you do? All 3 of these behavioral-based questions. And again, I want to give you just a couple minutes here to reflect on what would the STAR or STAR L response look like for one of these 3 questions. And then we'll have you kind of partner up and share those here in just a couple minutes. Go for it.
So my question is to give me where to start because I didn't have a basic knowledge. What I did was I studied. I studied consulting.
I have.
And then that way helped me and I was able. Yeah. I got good in that, so that's how. Give an example of the time you had.
Well, in the interest of time, we're gonna keep moving forward, but just out of curiosity, what was this like? How'd it go? Or how do you feel about the STAR method? Maybe that's a better question. What do we think?
More comfortable.
Yeah?
Yeah.
More organized, more comfortable? Good. Other thoughts?
It helped to process the information.
Yeah. Help to move through it. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I find that most of the time with responding to interview questions, if you just have a process that can be applied across all of them, it just makes life a lot easier and things a little bit less stressful. So hopefully it's helpful in the future as you walk into more interviews. Over the next few minutes, we're going to walk through just a series of questions about preparation and execution of the interview process in the form of multiple choice questions. So the first one that I have here is, when you're preparing for an interview, which of these should a candidate avoid researching? Past, current, or employee experiences, major accomplishments of that organization, major failures of that organization, or the mission and strategic plan of that organization. So which of these should you avoid researching as a candidate? Other thoughts?
Employee experiences.
Yeah, so I hate to start it off like this, but this is certainly a trick question. So as a candidate, we would encourage you to know as much as you can about all of these things going in. And the most common response to this question is certainly C. You know, you see something like major failures are up there and like, oh, I don't want to talk about that with an employer. They might not offer me a job if I ask those questions. However, if you're aware of those things, it might help you develop some really helpful questions that you might want to know about before walking into work for that institution or organization. And so being armed with as much research about the organization or company can be really, really helpful. All right, for this next one, I'm going to give you a couple minutes here because I want you to rank order which of these are the best way to prepare for an interview from best to worst. All right, so who thinks they have an idea?
Was it true? DCB.
DCBA. Okay. Other thoughts?
And the other one,
Okay. Yeah, so going back to something that was mentioned a little earlier, typically our encouragement would be to try to replicate that environment as closely as possible as you can. And so with that in mind, having someone that doesn't know you read you interview questions will be about as close to that environment as you can get, which is kind of the logic behind A being a little bit better than B, which would be someone you know reading off those interview questions to you and providing feedback. There's something about getting feedback from an objective individual, someone that doesn't really know you, that oftentimes might be more honest or transparent or helpful. C would be then following B, because at least saying answers out loud in front of the mirror, you might notice things that you wouldn't if you were just writing down your responses. So certainly starting at the top and working our way down would be kind of the best to the worst. All right, next up. How long before an interview starts should a candidate arrive? And let's say this is a physical interview that you're going in for. So how long before that interview begins do you think you should show up at that location.
20 to 30 minutes.
Okay. Yeah, so, the real answer to this is it depends on the person. But somewhere between B and D is certainly probably best practice. Now, there's some things to keep in mind. One of them would be, if you've never been to that location before, certainly I would encourage you to err on the side of caution. Show up a little bit earlier, that way you can figure out parking. If it's a multi-story building, you have time to navigate that and you're not worried about being late. If it's a location you've been to before, 10 to 15 minutes is oftentimes a good amount of time where you can go in, maybe find a restroom to make sure that your appearance is what you hope for it to be. What we find oftentimes for candidates that show up really early is that sometimes they give themselves time to psych themselves out before the interview. So you might be asking questions in your head like, I don't know if I can do this, or am I really prepared for this opportunity? And so sometimes showing up too early can be a little bit detrimental. Now, again, this is very individualistic. So some people that might be helpful for, but for others, especially if you have anxiety about those situations, it's not always helpful to show up that early. So those are a couple of things to keep in mind. Next up, which of these statements is false? What do we think? What's that?
B.
You think D? Okay. Others? Yeah, so this one's kind of tricky. The canned response here is letter C. So read letter C again. What do you think we might do to tweak that? So that one, yeah, absolutely. I've had so many candidates that go into interviews and talk about an interruption that broke their train of thought because their phone went off in their purse or their bag or their pocket when they were trying to respond to a question. So our encouragement is that your phone's on silent when you're in the interview setting. I definitely don't go to the extreme of saying, don't take your phone into the interview with you, because you never know how you might need to use it while you're in there. If you get a question about availability or something like that from an employer. But certainly I would encourage you to have that thing on silent so that you can laser focus in on the responses and things like that don't interrupt your train of thought when trying to respond. I want to go back to B because a lot of candidates don't realize that regardless of the type of interview they're going in for, your interview really does kind of start when you physically enter that space because a lot of times whoever the hiring authority is, they'll gather input from everyone that individual interacted with during the entirety of the experience. So even if that's an administrative support professional who's greeting you before you go sit down in the lobby, you have an opportunity to make an impression with that person that might be really, really impactful to whoever that hiring authority is. So certainly something to keep in mind. If a candidate is being interviewed by multiple people, they should focus their eye contact on the person who is asked the question they're answering, or maintain a balance of eye contact between all interviewers. What do we think? Yeah, absolutely. So you want to make sure that everyone in that space feels included in those responses, for sure. So the answer would certainly be B. Before we do a little bit of Q&A, I want to give just some of my, what I would call quick tips about executing interviews at a high level. And this kind of ranges from everything from phone interviews to video interviews and in-person interviews. The first one is, it's a great idea, especially when you have a phone or a video interview coming up, that you practice responding or talking in those settings exactly where you're going to be. So some of you may or may not know that the Career Center has dedicated spaces that you as students can reserve for interviews. So if you need a private professional space to execute an interview, we can provide those for you as students. You can reserve those rooms from the Career Center's website, just so you know for the future. But wherever that space is that you plan to use, we definitely encourage you to practice Zooming or talking on the phone in that space so that things like Wi-Fi or cell signal are not things that you are concerned about day of. So practice in advance and replicate that setting. I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but again, you should treat any interview as an open book test versus a closed book test. Having notes nearby that include your CV, that include some potential star or fit responses to the questions you think might come is a really, really good practice and can make you feel more confident in glancing down and delivering those responses in the moment, especially. This is certainly a tip based on the last couple of years, but it's been kind of funny at times to talk with graduate PhD students about some of their interviews and their dog barking in the background, or maybe a child that was making a lot of noise during their interview, et cetera. And so again, just knowing different locations that you could utilize. Again, Career Center is an option where it's going to be noise-free is appropriate. There have been psychological studies that have shown that even if you are interviewing on the phone or via Zoom, being in full kind of dress professional or business professional dress can help improve your confidence in delivery in an interview setting. So based on that research, we would encourage you to dress the part. If you are, even if it's over the phone and they can't see you, dressing up sometimes will put your mind in a different place to deliver at a higher level. So we definitely encourage that. This last tip is one that mostly comes from my perspective as an interviewer. So before I worked on campus, I got to conduct lots of interviews for different roles. And one of the things that always stood out to me was that the candidates who took a couple of seconds to gather their thoughts in their mind before they started answering the questions, oftentimes performed on a higher level than their peers who did not. And what I've gathered from that are really two specific things. First off, if you take 3 to 5 seconds to pause before you deliver a response, you give yourself enough time to put your STAR approach in place mentally before you start speaking out loud. So that's something that's very, very helpful. The other reason why this is a great strategy to employ is that, let's say you're in an interview setting and the first 4 questions that you get, you deliver awesome responses for. As soon as they ask the question, you jump right in, you know that your responses are on point. But question 5 trips you up a little bit. You're not really sure what experience you want to pull from to deliver an excellent response. Well, if you've jumped right in and answered in questions 1 through 4 for that employer, but on question 5, it's taking you a little bit of time, you're going to start sweating. You're going to start feeling nervous. You're going to start wondering what they're thinking about you taking time to respond to that question, which is not what you want in those moments. However, if on questions 1 through 4, you've trained that interviewer to know that after every question, you're going to take 3 to 5 seconds to pause, put your thoughts together, and then execute. By question 5, they know that that's what you're doing all the time. And even if it takes you 5 to 8 seconds versus 3 to 5 seconds, it's not going to feel nearly as long because you've already trained them with what your delivery method's going to be. So again, pausing before you respond is an excellent strategy. It buys you time. It also makes sure that you can put your thoughts together before you dive in. I want to make sure that you're aware of a couple of specific resources that the Career Center provides that you can utilize in terms of interview prep. Big Interview is a resource that's available on the Career Center's website where you can walk through mock interviews. You can select questions by industry that are most appropriate for the field that you're going into. You can look at general questions like the most common ones that I referenced earlier in our conversation. But this is a place where you can go out, you can start an interview, an actual human who's recorded will ask you the question, you can record your response and then watch it back and critique yourself. You can also share that with peers, career advisors, faculty, to give feedback to your responses as well. So again, Big Interview is a tool that's available from our website and something that you have wide open access to 24/7 if you want some ways to prepare for interviews. In addition to this, like I mentioned before, the career advising team at the Career Center is more than happy to do mock interviews with you whenever it's convenient for you. The way that we build out our mock interviews is when you request those appointments, we ask you to share the medium that you're meeting. So if it's phone, Zoom, in person, we ask you to share with us also what the job is that you're applying for. Because then what we do is we try to get into our bank of questions and build the most closely replicated or most predictable types of questions set that we can before asking you those questions. So just know that those are two ways that you can prep as you start to get into the interview phase of things. All right, well, I want to take a few minutes here and fill in any gaps and answer any questions that I can about interviews. So what types of things can I respond to? Go for it.
Are there any questions that we should not answer during the job interview?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. The short answer is yes. Another resource that I will point out to you all that I'd encourage you to reference is the Career Center's Resume and Interview Guide. There's a PDF. If you just search Resume and Interview Guide, it'll pull it up. But there are some protected categories, questions that would allude to things such as if you have a disability as a candidate, you don't have to disclose that information. It's your right as a candidate to choose when you do. So there are example questions like that that you can choose not to answer. And legally, they can't hold you, they can't hold that against you in terms of how you perform overall in the interview setting. A list of those questions is again available through the Resume and Interview Guide. But you can also just kind of Google list of protected categories for interview questions and learn some of that too. That's an excellent question. Thanks for asking. What else?
Anything about your weakness? So what would be the answer?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So tell me about one of your weaknesses. Very common interview question. It's probably top 5 in terms of interviewers' list of general questions. Typically speaking, you still want to use the STAR approach because you want to give them an example of the weakness. With the weakness, you always want to make sure to address what you've learned from that weakness or how you are improving on that weakness. So for example, if a weakness was, maybe a weakness was delegating tasks to team members, you want to give an example of when that has been a challenge for you and then what you've learned from it and how you're attempting to address it. If you don't address what you've learned and how you're trying to improve, that can leave you to susceptible to some judgment decisions by the employer. So you want to make sure that you really hit in on the lesson learned or what you're doing to improve there with the weakness question. It's a good question. What else?
Usually the last part of the interview is the interviewer asks you if you have any questions for them. So are there any standard sets of questions that we need to ask?
Yeah, awesome question. So the Resume and Interview Guide has a list of questions that we encourage candidates choose from to ask. And so that would be a resource that you could use. The encouragement directly that I always give candidates when thinking about what types of questions they might want to ask that interviewer or the organization is thinking about the next step in the process. So typically what's going to happen after the interview is you're either going to get an offer or you're not. Usually walking out of that interview setting, it's a really good idea for you to have all the information that you possibly can to know what your answer might be if the offer is what you want it to be. And so I encourage candidates to ask the questions that are going to make that decision easier. So if you need to know things about work-life balance, ask questions about work-life balance. If you need to know things about potential for growth in the company, ask questions about what typical employees see in terms of room for growing with that organization. So focus on what's most important to you as a candidate. And that's where the list of questions in the Resume and Interview Guide can come in handy because you might know what's most important to you, but not quite know how to ask those questions. And that's where those examples can be really, really helpful. But again, walking away from the interview setting, having a really good idea, would I want to go after this opportunity if I receive an offer or not so much? Those are the types of questions that can be most helpful. What else?
So if they ask, what is your expected salary? How should we answer?
Yeah, what's your expected salary? Well, first off, it's not very common for them to ask that face-to-face. So we encourage candidates to try to do salary negotiation via email when it's absolutely possible. But my advice just in terms of approaching that conversation is knowing your value or knowing your worth. And there's a couple of different resources that you can utilize to help. Number one, ONET Online is a database of information about jobs. And one of the pieces of information that's included is salary information. So for example, if I was applying to be a soil scientist in Massachusetts, those jobs might pay differently than applying for a soil scientist job in Kansas because of cost of living and things like that. And so you can look up that salary and wage data based on state.
Can you say that again? The website?
Yep, ONET, O-N-E-T, online.org is the website. And you can look up thousands of types of roles across all industries and find that salary and wage data. So that's one piece of information that you can use. Another piece of information that can be really useful are what's called K-State's post-graduation statistics. So each year we compile data on what the prior year's graduates of bachelor's, master's, and PhD candidates go into after they graduate, when we request their salary data as well, so that we can share that back with you all as candidates in aggregate form. Of course, it's not tied to any specific person, but we want you to know, if I am in plant pathology, what do PhD grads in plant pathology typically make when they leave? And so you can see kind of what they typically make. You can cross-reference that with the ONET data. And then once you look at those things and review some salary information on job descriptions, it'll give you a pretty good sense for what's equitable based on the jobs that you're applying for. So those are some things that I would keep in mind. Also know, we are happy to help you navigate the salary negotiation conversation one-on-one. Those situations are often very individualistic based on the company, and that's a common thing that we help students with in advising appointments. What else?
How do you approach a rude interview, like an intimidating interview?
Yeah. Personality styles in interviewing vary widely. You get some people that are very kind and approachable, and you get some people that are not. And, I think there's a couple of different things to be mindful of with that question, Roselle. The first one is, what does that tell you about the unit or the organization that you're applying for? If an interviewer has a certain personality approach, does that give you a clue to what it might be like working with that person or in that organization? So I would always encourage you to be reflective about that. However, sometimes people have bad days, right? We all have bad days where we might not be as approachable or kind. And so one of the things that I always encourage candidates to do if they have a poor experience with one specific interviewer is ask to meet or have a conversation with somebody else that works in that team or with that organization to get a feel for, is this one bad egg or is this kind of a bad carton of eggs? And so that can be really helpful. But I also think it's a good idea for you to think about what does this mean for the bigger picture of the organization? Is this a company that, do I care about the interviewer's attitude and their approach towards me? Or is that something that is not necessarily as important because it meets my salary expectations, my location expectations, and kind of what I want out of the role? So you kind of have to balance what's most important to you in terms of values with the job and decide, is it worth it, is it not?